Hey everybody, you're watching part one of the CareMinds podcast episode with Rany El Diwany, Director of Product Management at Athena Health. In this part of the episode, together with Rany, we're talking about the importance of understanding which business problem you're solving as a product manager, the design thinking process Rany uses to understand the problem space, number one factor that would ruin your project, and Rany's how-tos of challenging the problem space. Let's get started. Rany, thank you very much for joining this CareMinds podcast episode. It's so great to have you here.
Thanks for having me. Really excited to be part of this.
Rany is an expert in his domain, and actually, my pre-recording with Rany kicked off with diving into the topic of exploring problems. And Rany highlighted that there are lots of similar problems that his peers are trying to solve on various occasions. My first question to you would be the problem discovery approach, something that we've touched base on previously. Essentially, the premise is not understanding the problem space is a root cause for working on the same problems, and you're essentially are reinventing the wheel. So can you elaborate on that point in a little bit more context?
Yeah, definitely, Daniel. So, really what's key for all of what we do in product management is understanding that we are solving a business problem. Yes, we're building software, but it's in service to the problems that we're solving. So I always want to make sure, whether it's myself or my teams that report into me, they understand what is the key thing you're trying to solve. And a good barometer for that I tell my teams are try to explain it to someone that wasn't in healthcare or even that didn't work at the same company. And if you can explain the problem to them in a way that they understand it, that means you've simplified it in a way that it's clear. And then, really, what's important, once we can understand and align on that approach, one of the key things that we like to do is think through the design thinking principle, or the double diamond principle. If you've never heard of it, the way that it works is your first diamond is essentially your discovery phase, followed by your second diamond is the definition phase. And the way we define that is discovery is understanding the problem, always understanding the problem first. And then your definition phase is just understanding the solution. Okay, so you always start making sure you have full understanding what the problem is before you even ideate and try to figure out ways you're going to solve that. And then the concept of the diamond is that it diverges and then it converges. And you do that twice. So in your discovery phase, when you understand the problem, you're really collecting tons of different information, both qualitative and quantitative information. You're talking to customers, you're looking at industry trends, you're collecting actual analytic data, you're trying to figure out what the problem space looks like so you can see the forest from the trees. And once you get to that point where you start seeing those same comments or points coming up over and over again, you're probably reaching the point where you're about ready to start converging. And you say, okay, I have this huge collection of information over here. Again, some qualitative, some quantitative. Now I'm going to converge and try to organize that, right? Maybe I have different work streams, or maybe different horizons, or different phases, or categories of things that we need to solve. And then you actually get to that point where you're about to transition from discovery to definition, because you say, okay, here's my space. It looks like this. There's a lot. And usually, especially with healthcare, because of the complexity, you're going to want to prioritize that anyway, right? And then only at that point, you say, okay, here's all the things we're going to do, like that we need to look at, but we're going to start off here because we've deemed this to be the highest priority item. And now we're going to go into definition for that first work stream. We'll leave the other stuff aside for now. But what we've done is we've done a really good, thorough job understanding the problem space before even getting to the very first solution that we want to think through.
So do you attribute the absence or poor definition of the problem space to the issue where companies essentially are trying to reinvent the wheel and work on the same problems and present different solutions, or the question here is much deeper?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that if you haven't figured out the problem that you're trying to solve, when you get to the point in the day, whether that's days, weeks, months later, however long, where you're actually measuring success, someone the whole time might have been like, well, I was looking for A and you were looking for B. So of course you have to understand the same problem, but I think just as critical is building that alignment, right? So, one of the ways that we do that at Athena is we build pitch decks. And the pitch deck is literally, why are you working on this problem? What is it? How are you going to approach it? And getting to the point where you've kind of developed a plan that you can go and present and do your readouts, whether it's to leadership, to customers, to your partners in the ops side of the house, whoever, being able to do that readout and say, hey guys, this is what I'm looking at. This is how I've defined this problem. This is how we're thinking about approaching it. Does this make sense for you? Right? Because if you haven't aligned on what you're trying to solve and agreed on what the definition of success is to start, you're certainly going to arrive at an end state where not everyone is happy.
Great insightful points. How do you go about challenging the problem space in this case? Let's talk about the house.
Yeah, so we try to do whatever we can to be making unemotional decisions, right? Like we believe in the data. And of course, one of the prerequisites to that is that you're asking the right questions. If you're not asking the right questions and you're not collecting the right data, then you're not telling the story. But really, what we like to do is marry both that qualitative and quantitative data. So let's say you're in the discovery phase, right? And you're tackling a whole new problem that you're very unfamiliar with. That's where it's super helpful to be talking to your subject matter experts, whether that's internal or external customers or reading that you can find in various publications, and trying to at least get directionally where you need to land, right? And once you start kind of understanding the buckets of the problems, then you can kind of go in and peel back the layers of the onion. Many probably common principles that people out there listening have heard of before are, asking the 5 whys, right? Like, why are we doing that? Why is it important? Why does that need to happen at this point in the game and not this point, right? And like really just trying to break things down to a simple manner and just really like making sure you have an intimate understanding of the problem. And again, like I think communication is critical here, right? I need to be able to communicate to you, whether you are my customer, my stakeholder, my leader, even my directs, it doesn't matter, or especially engineers and UX, right? I need to be able to communicate to you what the problem is in a way where both of us leave that conversation thinking about it the same way as each other, right? If we leave the conversation and you thought it was problem A and I thought it was problem B, we're gonna have issues, right? We're not gonna be in sync in solving this problem. So, one of the key things that I always tell my PMs is you need to evangelize your space, right? Just because you understand it, it doesn't mean that everyone else does. And perception is reality. You need to be able to feel confident that even when you are not in the room, anyone else that's talking about your initiative or your feature or whatever, they're explaining it in the same way. And we're all speaking the same language. So, one of the other key principles here, right, is that once we've done our discovery, we've done our definition, we're building pitch decks and presenting roadmaps. One of the key things that I like to always emphasize is that your roadmap should be problem focused and not solution focused, especially because you don't know what you're going to learn between now and something that you might have queued up 2, 3, 4 steps along the way, right? I might know, hey, 6 months from now, the next big problem area that I might tackle is X, but I don't know how I'm going to solve it yet, especially because the things that I'm working of in advance of that thing that comes 6 months down the road, I'm going to learn a ton, right? I'm going to develop some solutions. I'm going to put something out the door and we're going to measure. We're going to say, all right, is this moving the needle on the things that are important to this initiative, right? Because again, anytime you're kicking off this work, you should be asking yourself the question of, well, how do we know that we succeeded? Like, how do we know we made a difference here? And identifying the appropriate metrics that actually validate that you're making a difference, right? So, of course, it's hard to think of roadmaps that are year 2, 3 years down the road, but any product leader is thinking about their 2, 3, 4, 5 year vision, right? So, if I'm thinking about my vision and how we're going to tackle things and like the general maybe order of what areas we're going to focus on one after another, I do need to make sure that's more talking about the problem itself rather than how I think I'm going to solve it today. Because in 6 months from now, I'm going to know way more than I know today, and that solution might not be relevant, and then my whole roadmap falls apart. But if I have a problem focused roadmap or an outcome focused roadmap, hopefully those things aren't changing over time because you're still wanting to solve those issues.
I wanted to ask you this question. When it comes to identifying the problem space and working on the things that you'd be later on putting in the roadmap, hopefully, how often do you find yourself in a situation where you need to kind of like debias yourself? In other words, is your framework and the workflow that you're used to is already built around the process of eliminating human biases as much as possible? Are you conscious of that, or is it something that you are kind of like just go with the flow and have a different outlook on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that you got to constantly remind yourself, right? Human bias is there, and like one of the things is really easy to get attached to a solution, even for instance. And what happens, sometimes you put that solution out and it doesn't generate the results that you were hoping. And you need to again remove that layer of emotion from the equation and say, hey, I'm confident that we've defined the right metrics that are going to tell a successful story here, and I see that this solution is not achieving those metrics, and we need to pivot. But in terms of like building this into a framework, I think part of it is just experience of making mistakes, and we learn from our mistakes. But really, when we think of the frameworks that we're using at Athena, our product managers that are building pitch decks, they're not the same pitch deck from one to the next, right? Like, and this is, of course, the difficulty and the challenge of product management. This is why it's a hard job, because there's not like a simple recipe that you can follow, right? I can come up with a beautiful pitch deck that tells a compelling story and, deliver an initiative that achieves great results. The next initiative, I can't necessarily just take that pitch deck and plaster it on and try to answer the same questions. It's not always the case. Like, you need to be thoughtful. You need to figure out what makes sense for the problem that you're working on. You're not going to be able to use the exact same solution over and over again. And that's the same thing like Agile in itself. Agile is a framework. It's not a recipe, right? So those are some of the challenges of the product management in general.
Thank you for watching part one of the CareMinds podcast episode with Rany El Diwany, Director of Product Management at Athena Health. Hit the like button if you like this episode. Drop us a comment below. We'd be excited to hear which topics in health tech product management realm we should cover next. Each like and comment we receive pushes this content to like-minded individuals like yourself. So help spreading the word and stay tuned for part two.